Hello, my name is Hal. Welcome to episode 2 of Echoes of the Valley. So today I wanted to touch on something that is Canada-wide and also come close to home here. Some good history for 2020 here in beautiful downtown Sandon, BC. In Canada in 1920, one thing that occurred was the changing of the 1-cent coin from the large penny, about that size, to the penny that we were accustomed to for so many years in our lives, that size. And in 1920, they followed the American example. The US had gone to a small 1 cent way back in the mid-1800s. And so Canada decided it was time to go for a coin that reflected a value of copper more similar to what was actually contained in the coin. So they downsized the penny, and since 1920 until they quit making them here recently, that was what or how it went. And the large cents remained in circulation for a while and eventually of course disappeared into people's collections. So in Sandon in 1920, they were spending pennies that were the large size. So 1920 was a special but sad year for Sandon. And 1920 was the official disincorporation of Sandon as a city. So it ended an era that was rather unusual. So I wanted to mention that in Canada there are hundreds of ghost towns. And every province has them. Many of them are mining, probably most of them are mining towns. But to my knowledge, there were only 2 ghost cities in Canada, and Sandon was one of them. And maybe I'll leave it to you to guess where the other one is, and we'll touch on that in another episode. But the city of Sandon's history is quite interesting. It was incorporated on January 1st of 1898. And the reasons for incorporation might seem strange now, but it was triggered by a visit from the provincial health inspector in 1897. And he came to Sandon and he looked at this booming place, completely unplanned, but building occurring on every square inch of land that was available. Well, you can imagine what the sanitation situation was like. And if you look at the old photos of Sandon pre-1898, you'll see that outhouses lined the creek as far as you could see, both sides. And you can think of that and then think of the 1,000 or so horses and mules that were stabled here, and put your imagination to work about what it might have smelled like. Anyway, the health inspector came to Sandon and he said, "This is an epidemic waiting to happen." And he ordered the incorporation of Sandon immediately. And so it was passed in cabinet, and it was passed under something called the Speedy Incorporation of Cities Act. And so it was created to be a city council and a mayor were elected. And their very first project was to deal with the sanitation situation here before it became an emergency. So the planners in Sandon looked at the valley. It was developing in a chaotic way. The creek continued to meander all the way through Sandon, taking up huge amounts of space, and of course it would change every spring. The creek would go on a bit of a rampage, and so people had been trying to build cribbings and structures to prevent it from eroding their particular place. And the creek was going every which way. And in fact, there was an island in the middle of Sandon, up approximately where the brick building that the museum is in today. If you look at the old photos, the creek split, and it left an island in the middle. So the problem with developing in Sandon was trying to find space. And so once they began to survey the land, which they did after the fact, there was already numerous buildings built on the land before the formal surveying of the town site. So everything was already a big jumble here, and no rhyme nor reason. So the city council was faced with the problem of having to sort that out as well. And they decided that the best thing to do would be to build a big wooden flume right through the entire downtown of Sandon to confine the creek. And that would make it uniform. It would allow for development to occur on both sides of the creek in a more orderly way. And it solved their sanitation problem because they could run all of the sewer lines from the buildings into the flume and dump the sewage into the creek. Well, that sounds awfully crude today, of course, but that was apparently a great solution in that day, unless you happen to live downstream from Sandon. So that was probably not so good for Three Forks or New Denver. But anyway, they ended up with this enormous big wooden structure built of Douglas fir beams, 12 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and that was what carried the combined creeks from Sandon and Carpenter Creeks through the entire downtown. It solved their pollution problem, at least in downtown Sandon, and it just became a natural concept to turn that flume, to plank the top over and make it into a street, because you can well imagine what the streets were like on a muddy day here, full of wagon ruts and horse manure and so forth. Horrible gumbo, I'm sure. Very few towns had really nice streets in that era, but this gave them almost the same as a paved street. So that idea probably evolved a little bit after the original concept of making a sewer and controlling the creeks and the erosion. So of course, once this structure was underway, which they started immediately in 1898, the downtown of Sandon just mushroomed, and very quickly all of the extra available space was gobbled up. There were many 3-story and 4-story buildings, and then the street evolved over top of the river. But before the city was incorporated and before the flume was built, the major part of the downtown core, most businesses and the saloons and hotels and things were built along Rico Avenue, which was the next street over from the wooden street. So anyways, this all began to evolve as a result of the new city. Now the city council, which I have a photo of here, this was the city council right after 1898, and they made the original city hall in a 3-story building that was owned by Johnny Harris on Rico Street, and that photo was taken in front of there. Another thing I have here, which is quite interesting, is just an old City of Sandon license here. It's been rather well protected, that we got from Coletti's store in Nelson. With some of the old City of Sandon records, and quite a nice letterhead on there. And one other artifact that I did want to show from the City of Sandon was this old assessment roll, and it was kindly given to me by George Stewart in 1972. And you can see that's for the year 1913, which I'll come back to in a minute or so. And it's a beautiful old thing. It's all written with a stick pen, of course, and the beautiful writing of the day. There you go. Very special memento of Sandon. Anyways, Sandon was booming when it was incorporated in 1898, and it would be unusual compared to other cities in Canada that probably incorporated and then continued to grow, or at least to stay fairly stable. Nelson, for example, today has a population that's similar to what it was in around 1900, but that wasn't the case in Sandon. So 2 years after the incorporation, the economy here was in trouble. Mining was slowing down. Sandon was plagued with labor issues, the unions fighting against the Mine Owners Association, and in May of 1900, a big fire that destroyed the whole of the downtown part of Sandon virtually, and the Sunnyside district up there. Major blow to Sandon at a very critical time. So that started the long decline of the city of Sandon. And following the 1900 fire, the downtown core was rebuilt, but it was done in a different way. It was a more orderly construction. Streets were typically wider. The buildings were smaller. There were a few three-story buildings, including this beautiful City Hall building that we're in. But everything downsized, and following the fire, the population was somewhere in about the 2000 mark, half of what it had been previous to that. And many of the people had been lured away to the Klondike, which was in the full swing of the gold rush at the time. So Sandon was in trouble. And through the early part of the 1900s, that economy continued to decline. The metal markets were poor. And by 1910, the population of Sandon had gone from thousands down to about 150. It was just an empty shell of a town. And so the community was struggling financially. The city was relying largely on fines that were directed at the prostitutes down in the houses of ill repute. And they were some of the few people that had enough money to pay taxes here. And so the city took advantage of that. In 1913, when Sandon went into receivership, Sandon was on the verge of its second big boom, but nobody knew it. And as I said earlier, there were about 150 people remaining in the big empty city. So in 1914, with the start of World War I, demand for metals worldwide became quite intense. And by a year later, metal prices had shot up sky high, and mining was returning in a very big way. So ironically, although the city was starting its receivership and heading for eventual disincorporation, the economy began to return, and nobody had known that this was going to happen at the time. People had expected that Sandon would be doomed, and they planned to go through with receivership. So anyways, things changed in a hurry, especially when it comes to war, and that began Sandon's next chapter of prosperity. However, most of the small mining companies had been absorbed by bigger ones, and the mines were consolidated, and the bigger mines that were here were able to bring in machinery, mechanization, and better milling processes, and they invested hugely in those, and as a result, it brought the tonnage way up, and they were able to produce the lower grade ores profitably. And some of the legacy of that remains to this day. You'll see, for example, in the Silversmith generating station here in Sandon, conversion to alternating current in 1916, and significant improvements in the efficiency of the machinery and so forth. That was all part of that big second boom period that happened in Sandon. So by 1918, things were in pretty good shape here, and about 2,000 people had returned to the city. Like I said earlier, it had dropped to about 150, just a shell of a city. But by 1918, things were doing quite well again here. But the city itself, the corporation, was in bad shape. It had been damaged by all the lean years. I don't think there was a huge amount of confidence here that Sandon was going to remain a boomtown much longer. And indeed, through the 1920s, after the war, the metal markets caught up. So supply caught up to demand. Metal prices dropped again, and by the big crash of 1929, the stock market crash, the mines were pretty well done for the end of the second boom. So even though things were looking much better by 1918, 1919, and even into 1920, in terms of the economy of Sandon, the proceedings had already gone so far. They'd been 7 years in receivership from 1913, and it was determined that that shouldn't be reversed, and so Sandon did end up in its final disincorporation in April of 1920. So one of the obligations of a city in those years was a police force. And there were a number of things that distinguished it from a town, for example, or a village. But in a city, you had to have your own police force, and Sandon did. So in this building that we're sitting in right now, a 3-story building built by the city, cost $3,500 to complete in those years, complete with all the beautiful woodwork up on the top and the tower with the bell on it. So in the bottom floor where we are now, there was a fire hall on one half of the building, and then the tall fire tower that went up for drying the hoses on the side with a bell on the top. So that was the number 1 fire hall. There was also jails in the basement here, two jail cells, and the jailer was resident in the building at the time, so there was always somebody here to keep an eye on the people that were in the clink. And then on the 2nd floor, which was where the main entrances were off of the flume, so you have to picture the flume stood about 6 feet above ground and was made into a wooden street on the top. So there was a half a flight of stairs went up to the main double doors that went into the center of the building. And better that they went up than went down, because they'd be tunneling in the deep snows in the winter if they'd have gone down. But anyways, half a flight of stairs went up, and you entered there, and it was the city clerk and various different city officials and offices there. I should mention that those stairs were frequently used in photographs of sports teams and various things. The fire department, for example, you'll see them in many of the old photographs. And then beautiful open area where you could look up onto the 3rd floor, and there was a banister around the top there, big wide beautiful stairs that went up, and you could go to the 3rd story. On the 3rd story there was the chief of police. There was a courtroom up there that occupied about half of the 3rd floor, and probably a couple of other offices. And so that was the way this building was originally, and it remained so until 1920. So in April of 1920, the act was passed in Parliament to disincorporate Sandon, and that was the final straw for the city of Sandon. It went into official disincorporation. All of the city staff were at that point non-existent, and the building actually was vacant, other than because the Sandon City Police no longer existed. The provincial police appointed a police officer for Sandon, and he occupied the apartment in the building that the jailer had occupied before. So anyways, the original building was beautifully finished, fancy moldings, beautiful stairs and banisters and things like that. And today, much of that was lost along the way. Most of it when the building was ultimately made into a school in 1925. The original Sandon School was condemned, and they moved it from the Sunnyside building. Hired contractors from Nelson to come in and strip this building and make it into a 2-room school with a small library and an apartment for one of the teachers. And we were fortunate in when our family was finally able to acquire this building and try to save it before it collapsed, and it was very, very close to it. We found in the floors that the contractor that did the conversion from it being a city hall into the school had, when they had, I guess the idea was with the school it had to be functional and plain, so they stripped all those beautiful moldings and things off, and they stuffed them into the floors in between the joists. They had to move the staircases, and so they had cut the floors open, and then somebody with perhaps a vision for the future thinking that someday somebody would discover this, they put all these things in. So the nice thing is we do have samples of all that, and eventually the building will be restored to look pretty much like it did back in 1900 when it was first built. But anyway, that's the sad story of what happened to the city. And so that was 100 years ago in 1920 that it ceased to be a city. In fact, it ceased to be any form of municipality. It didn't just diminish to a town or a village like some of the cities, old mining cities that survived did. This one just went from being a city to nothing. And like I say, today it's one of 2 ghost cities that I know of in Canada. Hopefully maybe some of you will have an idea. Maybe there's another one, maybe perhaps in Ontario or some other part of Canada, but it would be great to know. And we will carry on our discussion of other things that occurred in this beautiful building sometime in the future, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Bye for now.